Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from Mr. David Crowder, formerly of the Building Research Establishment. Yes, Ms. Gray.
Yes, could we have Dr. David Crowder, please?
Dr. Crowder. Good morning, Dr. Crowder. I gather you're going to take the oath.
Yes.
Well, there should be a testament there. Would you take it in your right hand, please, and read the words on the screen, if they are on the screen?
They are.
Good, thank you.
The affirmation's on the screen.
Well, then we need the... There we are.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now, please sit down and make yourself comfortable. Right. Yes, Ms. Grange, when you're ready. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Crowder. Can I first start by thanking you very much for attending this public inquiry to give your evidence today? It is very much appreciated. If you have any difficulty understanding any of the questions that I'm going to ask, please just ask me to repeat the question, or I'll put the point in a different way. We're going to take scheduled breaks today, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, but if you feel that you need an additional break, please do not hesitate to tell us. And please can you try and keep your voice up, because there is a transcriber sitting to your right who's taking a note of your evidence. Try and keep your voice up and don't speak too fast. Thank you. Okay. Now, you've provided the inquiry with 3 witness statements. Let's look at those. The first is at BRE 3032332. There is that statement. And if we go on to page 31, we can see from the bottom that it's dated the 14th of September 2020. And is that your signature there?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Let's look at your second statement. That's at BRE 3043716. And if we look at page 76, we can see that's dated the 1st of October 2021. And again, is that your signature there?
Yes, it is.
And then last, you have provided a voluntary third witness statement to the inquiry. That is at BRE 3047668. And if we go to page 55 of that document, we can see that that's dated the 24th of January 2022. And again, is that your signature?
Yes, it is.
Have you read those 3 witness statements recently?
Yes, I have.
And can you confirm that the contents of those witness statements are true and accurate?
Yes, I confirm.
Thank you. Have you discussed the evidence that you're going to give with anybody before coming here today?
Only with my solicitor, and I had to make contact with former colleagues at BRE to obtain the documents that I've relied upon in preparing these statements.
I see. But all you did was obtain the documents from them?
Yes,
you didn't
correct.
Discuss your evidence with them? No, thank you. Now, I want to start by asking you some questions about your background and your qualifications. If we can turn up your first witness statement again, BRE 3032332, and on page 2, paragraph 5, you tell us there in the final lines that you hold a Bachelor of Science degree in Forensic and Investigative Science, specialising in fire engineering and fire investigation. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
When did you obtain that degree?
I graduated in May 2006.
Yeah. And from which university? Was that the University of Central Lancashire?
Yes, it was.
Great. And staying with paragraph 5, you also tell us that you've obtained a PhD in the impact of fire chemistry, specifically flammability and toxicity in fatal fires. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And was that also from the University of Central Lancashire?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, thank you. When did you obtain your PhD?
I believe the award is dated January 2015.
Right, yeah, thank you. Now, we're going to come on to some questions about your work at the BRE in a moment, but is it right that you joined the BRE in 2006?
Yes, that's correct.
And can we therefore take it that you worked towards your PhD alongside your day-to-day work at the BRE?
Yes, I did.
And so that would have been between 2007 and 2015, is that correct?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. Now, looking back at paragraph 5 of that second statement, you also tell us that you are a chartered engineer registered with the Engineering Council by the Institution of Fire Engineers. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
When did you become a chartered engineer and member of the Institute of Fire Engineers?
I believe that was August 2017,
Yeah.
thereabouts. I was an associate member prior
Yeah.
to that.
Great. And if we can look at your third witness statement now, BRE 3047668, and at page 3, paragraph 13, there you summarise your professional experience and you explain, you say this: I have extensive experience in the field of fire safety, having been involved in a wide range of large-scale experimental work, testing, inspections and fire investigations, particularly with respect to new developments in the built environment. I have worked on a wide range of investigations and projects for the UK government, the EU and private concerns. I specialise in investigating fire development, the performance of fire protection measures and systems during real fire incidents, as well as the regulatory aspect of performance in these areas. Is that all correct?
Yes, that's all correct.
And moving down to paragraph 14, you tell us this. You say, I provided expert witness evidence for legal cases where there's been extensive or unusual fire spread, as well as numerous cases where there are disputes concerning the design and construction of premises which impact on fire safety. I've been instructed by both prosecution and defence in cases under the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005, as well as murder, manslaughter, arson with intent, and reckless arson cases, and have given evidence at Crown Court. And you tell us that you've also assisted in matters relating to both liability and quantum for damages in civil disputes, as well as identifying opportunities for recovery. My experience in civil proceedings includes giving evidence at the High Court, the Singapore Supreme Court, and as part of mediation, arbitration and adjudication proceedings. So you're a very experienced expert witness in this field, yes?
Probably, yes. My experience is what it is.
Thank you. Now, I want to turn now to your career at the BRE. And if we go back to your second witness statement, and if we look at page 49 of that, and if we look at paragraph 161, just the first 5 lines of that paragraph, you say, I was a consultant within the fire safety group from the 2nd of October 2006, when I joined BRE, to the 20th of July 2011. Consultants were the most junior grade of staff within what was then termed the professional grades. I was responsible for my own tasks as assigned to me by other more senior staff, though was later given overall responsibility for projects, albeit with mentoring from others, predominantly Martin Shipp and David Charters. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So you've told us that you've had some mentoring during that period by Martin Shipp and David Charters. Can you help us? Who was actually your line manager during that period? So that's from October 2006 when you joined the BRE to July 2011.
My line manager was Stephen Manchester.
Yeah. And what was his role in the BRE?
At that time, I believe his title was Business Group Manager for Fire Safety.
Yeah. And can you help us? When you first joined the BRE in 2006, were you given any training, bespoke training by the BRE?
Yes, is the short answer. We were sent on various courses and linked to my PhD studies, also went to conferences and so on to try and pick up as much knowledge as quickly as possible.
Yeah. So was that a specific programme of training that kicked in at the beginning of your time at the BRE?
No, it wasn't predefined. It was, what's the word? Opportunistic, I suppose. Whatever became available that was relevant to the work that I happened to be doing at the time and that was considered worthwhile for us to be sent on. Sorry, I say us. This was the same for me as for all other consultants. There were a few during that period within the fire safety group.
Yes, I see. And were there any was there any training provided in relation to topics which touched on fire investigation specifically?
I don't believe there was formal training. There was the mentoring predominantly from Martin Shipp was the input that I got in relation to fire investigation.
Yeah.
My formal training I'd obtained as part of my academic studies, predominantly my undergraduate studies. And then what I learnt through working with Martin Shipp was, if you like, moving from traditional fire investigation, origin and cause, how and where fires start, to this sort of fire safety, fire protection focused style of fire investigation.
Yes, I see. And what about external fire spread? Did you receive any specific training, or did you go on any particular courses which assisted with the topic of external fire spread?
No, certainly not during that time. I don't think, other than occasional presentations sort of in-house to staff about the test methods, I don't think I received any formal training on external fire spread. But again, there was the mentoring generally as and when incidents cropped up. So an example that's in my statement is when I accompanied Sarah Colwell to the Curl Street fire in Glasgow in
Yeah.
2007, 2008.
Yeah. And you mentioned there at the beginning of your answer, you said sort of in-house to staff about the test methods, that there was some training to that effect. What test methods are you talking about there?
The range of things that BRE offered. So there were Friday update meetings. So that the company used to hold every Friday morning. There would be a bit of an update on, how various aspects of the business are going. And then not every week, but there would be, particular members of staff would be invited every so often to come and give a presentation on the work that they are doing, to try and give everyone a broad understanding of the range of services that BRE offers, given it's a very diverse organisation in terms of its activities.
Yeah. And what specific presentations can you remember receiving relevant to external fire spread?
Probably only, again, presentations that broadly explained the 8414 test and the equivalent LPS was of particular interest because of, obviously, BRE was very keen to push the loss prevention standards.
Yes.
To make sure people were aware of those.
Yeah. So you talked about the loss prevention standards which insurers might be very interested in. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And can you remember who delivered that informal briefing?
I don't specifically, but it would have been either Sarah Colwell or Steve Howard, who were the relevant section heads at the time.
Yeah. Now, when you started at the BRE, did you read, for example, previous BRE fire investigation reports? Was that part of what you did to get up to speed?
I did. It's something I probably pursued myself rather than being directed to. BRE at the time had, well, when I first started, BRE had a very large paper-based archive in one of its buildings. And for various reasons, there was a time when they had to thin the archive. And so I devoted quite a bit of time to trying to go and see what was in there and equally recover certain things that I felt really shouldn't be disposed of. So I spent a fair bit of time. And again, it was linked to my PhD studies at that time. I wanted to learn as much as I could, as quickly as I could.
Yeah. Do you remember reading, for example, the investigation report into the Knowsley Heights fire in 1991 in Liverpool?
I do, but I don't think it would have been as early as the period when I was a consultant. I think I probably read that a bit later on.
Yeah.
But I do remember reading it, yes.
And what about the Garnet Court fire in 99?
Yes, the same.
Yeah. What about the investigation of real fires project reports? Do you remember reading any of those?
I certainly remember skimming them and looking through some of the fires of special interest that were contained in them, but I can't claim to have read them cover to cover all the way back to, whatever it is, like 1988, I think was the earliest one. Yeah.
And just thinking about the period after you started then, between October and July 2011, was there any formal training about fire investigations during that 5-year period provided to you?
Again, I don't think so. I think it was mentoring from Martin Shipp.
Yeah. Now let's turn briefly to your third witness statement at this point. Again, BRE 3047668. And on page 6, paragraph 26, there you tell us, you say there was no formal fire investigation unit at this time in BRE. Various members of the fire safety group were simply involved in conducting fire investigations, whether on behalf of government or private clients. The other business areas within the division were all concerned with testing and certification. Now, can you just help us? Who were the various members of the fire safety group who were involved in conducting fire investigations at this time? So thinking back to 2006 through 2011.
So Martin Shipp was the lead, effectively, in terms of fire investigation. There was Kelvin Annable, who worked a lot on compiling the quarterly reports and then the end-of-year reports as part of that project.
Can you just do his, give us his surname again?
Kelvin Annable.
Annable. Yeah. A-N-N-A-B-L-E?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Tom Lennon would occasionally attend fires, particularly where there was an interest in structural fire performance. Sarah Colwell, when there was areas of interest that were relevant to her expertise.
Yeah. And what would those be? What would be the trigger points for Sarah Colwell to become involved in a fire investigation?
At that time, her expertise was external fire spread and cladding.
External fire spread and cladding?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Now, did you understand those members of the group that you just described to have had any specific training or undergone any specific qualifications in relation to fire investigation?
I believe Martin Shipp had. He was involved with, and apologies, I'm going to struggle to remember the name. There was a fire investigation course that was run in East Anglia quite regularly, and he got involved in that and indeed other training activities. I believe he did something with the ATF over in the US at some stage as well. Aside from that, I don't know what formal qualifications or training anyone else had.
Yeah. You said earlier that Sarah Colwell monitored you in terms of fire investigation, or mentored you, when you referred to accompanying her to the Curl Street fire in Glasgow.
Yes.
Was that a regular thing for Sarah Colwell to mentor you where there were fire investigations that she might be involved in?
No. I think probably during my entire career at BRE, Sarah probably attended fewer than 5 fires with me. Apologies, I would struggle to remember specific examples. It wasn't a huge number.
Right, yeah. And of those people that you've mentioned in this fire investigation part of the fire safety group, who was the most senior of those people?
Martin Shipp.
Yeah. And would he supervise the work being carried out on fire investigations, whether for government or private clients?
Yes, he would.
Yeah. Now, if we can return to your second witness statement and thinking more about your progression through the BRE, if we go page 49 of your second statement, paragraph 162, you then tell us that you say, I was a senior consultant within the fire safety group from the 21st of July 2011 to the 31st of March 2013. At this time, I was given responsibility for the fire investigation business stream as one of the 4 business streams which had been identified around 2011 within the fire safety group. The 4 business streams were fire engineering, risk, DSEAR, research and fire investigation. I was tasked with trying to re-establish fire investigation as its own self-sustaining income stream, as it was considered that government income, and if we go over the page, was in decline and could not be relied upon if the business was to survive. Now, as a senior consultant during that period, so now 2011 to 2013, who did you report to? Who was your effective line manager?
That continued to be Stephen Manchester.
Yeah. And who was it within the BRE who in 2011 had identified the 4 business streams you refer to there?
I'm not sure. I remember a meeting where the 4 streams were introduced, probably by Stephen Manchester. Sorry, I say I remember. I don't remember a specific meeting, but I remember it being introduced at a meeting.
Yeah.
I would presume, as with a lot of these sorts of developments at BRE, that there was some sort of business planning process that had been gone through in the preceding months, which at that time I wouldn't have been involved in, which would have resulted in the identification of these streams, because at that time, and this was, in the years following the financial crash, there was a big push to try and proactively develop the business and identify, where there were funding streams available so that it could continue to be financially viable.
Yes, I understand. Just looking back, if we could go back a page to see paragraph 163, and you're describing, 162, back a page in your statement. You describe those 4 business streams, 4 lines down there, and you say they're fire engineering. Then we've got risk DSEAR. Is DSEAR dangerous substances and explosive atmospheres regulations?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. And can you help us? By whom were you tasked with trying to re-establish fire investigation as its own self-sustaining income stream?
That was Carol Atkinson, the then Chief Executive Officer of BRE Global.
Yeah. And when you say there that you were re-establishing that, had it previously been a self-sustaining stream of income?
That was my understanding. I don't have particularly good details of what that was, but I understand there was I don't know whether it was ever a business unit, but there was certainly a formal fire investigation unit within BRE, which I believe was subsumed into fire safety sometime in the 90s, or whatever the precursor to fire safety would have been.
Right, yes. So we're talking about the 90s or pre the 90s, are we?
Yes.
For that, yeah. And what was your understanding as to how and why that had ceased to be the case? It had ceased to be its own self-sustaining income stream?
I don't know, is the honest answer. No, I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah. And just focusing on the very last part of paragraph 162 that we read, the very last line of page 49 and on to page 50, by whom was it considered that government income was in decline and could not be relied upon if the business was to survive?
I would say that's something that, if not everyone, certainly the large majority of the people in fire safety sort of recognised, that we, as a team, when I started at BRE, there were sort of regular 3-year research programs undertaken where you'd identify, an area that needed work and development and focus on it properly for 3 years. And by around 2011, frameworks were coming to a close, and there weren't new frameworks that were coming onto stream, and there wasn't really an indication that, certainly not that the same number would be maintained. So yes, it was a concern.
Yeah. And so when you're talking about the business there, you're talking about the whole of the BRE, yes?
No, sorry. In terms of my experience at that time, it would have been confined to the fire safety group. So
right.
That was our concern as a group. I wasn't really getting that exposed to the wider business.
I see.
Although, having said that, I'm afraid I couldn't say when. I do recall sort of company-wide presentations, the annual update on the figures and so on, talking about this need to shift from, and I'm going to pick numbers out of the air to illustrate, but say if 75% government to 25% private business split, and trying to shift that balance in the other direction so that there was this diverse portfolio of clients and not this over-reliance on government, given the way things were going.
Yes, thank you. And what was your understanding at the time about the extent to which government income was in decline?
Sorry, we're still talking about when I was a senior consultant?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So 2011 through 2013 at that point.
Yeah, so my awareness probably increased quite substantially during that time, because as part of my work to try and find a customer base for this business stream, I started looking a lot more at what the marketplace looked like and what was going on, and that's where I became aware of things like the Red Tape Challenge, where government was actively pushing to reduce its involvement in fire safety. There had been I think it was around 2010, the Fire Futures Review, which was about decentralising fire safety, government having less of a presence in fire safety and encouraging industry to take the lead in this belief that, a belief that it had, that the industry would lead the way and do what it needed to do. And that probably coloured, affected, I don't know what the right word is, but everything that followed was cognizant of that. And again, it's part of what you need to do to keep the business going.
Yeah. And did you pick that up solely from public government announcements, or did you have any private conversations with government clients about those matters you've just been discussing?
I probably got the odd hint from people like Brian Martin, but, you know, to his credit, he had a role as a civil servant, so it wasn't for him to sort of elaborate on all these things. I suspect it came up on one or two occasions, but there weren't ever any in-depth conversations directly with government officials.
Right, yeah. And what kind of hints? You said I probably got the odd hint from people like Brian Martin. What kind of hint are you thinking about?
I probably would have asked him, or probably did ask him, you know, where's the next research project coming? What sort of things might we be doing next? And the general response along the lines that, well, you know, that it isn't going to be what it was, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Now, if we can go down to page 50 now of your second witness statement. Oh, we're there. And look at paragraph 164. You tell us there, you say, I became a principal consultant and business group manager of fire investigation, it now being its own standalone business group on the 1st of April 2013, and remained in this role until the 31st of August 2014. During this time, I continued the general objective of soft selling and promotion as above, though I also became increasingly involved in active dissemination of information, most notably in relation to the Lakanal House fire, on which I gave 36 presentations in the 17 months in this role following the conclusion of the inquest, plus another 17 presentations on other subjects. Presentations I gave are those listed within this period in my first witness statement to the inquiry. Now, we will come back to some detailed questions about Lakanal House and your involvement in investigating that fire. But just sticking with your career for now, when you became business group manager of fire investigation in April 2013, who else worked in that particular team or unit at that time?
In April 2013, so I'm just making sure I've got my dates right. Kira Holland, I suppose, was part of the business by then. She joined in October 2012.
Yeah.
I believe.
And anyone else? Was it just you and her?
Yes, it was just the two of us, actually.
Right. Yeah. And to whom did you report when you were in that principal consultant role?
Well, as a result of becoming a business group manager, I then, I think for a while, reported directly to Debbie Smith, who at that time was technical director of fire and security, I believe.
Yeah. Now, did you put in place any training? I mean, it sounds like it's only Kiara Holland. Did you put in place any training for the staff that were involved in fire investigations at that time?
Not a course per se, although I say, sorry, I stopped myself there. I think Kira did attend the Leeds, there was a Leeds short course linked to its MSc, so she was sent on that at some stage. I couldn't say when, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
And then similar to before, she received also mentoring from Martin Shipp, and sort of the general ongoing development of staff, as was normal really at that time.
Yeah. So what role did Martin Shipp continue to have in this fire investigation work now that you're the principal consultant and business group manager of that group?
So Martin was still, I think his title was Technical Development Director within fire safety, but he continued to have a strong interest in fire investigation, and was keen to see the business group succeed and grow. And so, you know, whenever he had availability, that's not fair. He split his time. I think he tried to split and commit a fair proportion of his time
right.
to the respective business streams.
Right, I see. Yeah. Now, looking at paragraph 165 then of that second witness statement that's on the screen, you say in the first 4 lines there, I became head of fire investigation and expert witness services on the 1st of September 2014 and stayed in the role until I left the BRE on the 24th of May 2019. The title signified that I remained business group manager for fire investigation, but had also assumed responsibility for expert witness services across all disciplines in the BRE group of companies. Now, what had prompted your move to head of fire investigation and expert witness services in September 2014? Was that a promotion?
It was. I had. I'd taken an increasing interest in the expert witness work across BRE. It was part of that sort of trying to get to know the other areas of the business and realising that there were all of these experts doing various things in fairly disparate subjects, from acoustics to structures to water ingress and so on, and realising that there had been oversight previously from 2 individuals. Sandy Mackay was one, and Stuart, and sorry, his surname fails me, but there'd been 2 individuals within the construction part of the business that had been leading the expert witnesses for a number of years. They were both getting to a stage where they wanted to hand the reins over to somebody, and as a result of, I'd probably say I had an unusually broad range of experience of the courts by that time, and in that I'd done civil proceedings and criminal and inquests. So it was part of those sorts of discussions you have about career progression and what next. And it was put to me as, if you want to get on to the next step, you need to take on responsibility for these, which I did.
Yeah. And who did you report to in that role?
I've got a feeling very initially I might have been reporting to Debbie Smith, but if I did, it wasn't for very long, because it was around that time that she was promoted to Managing Director of BRE Global, and then Julie Bragula was made Director of Fire and the Building Technology Group, which sort of, what had previously been parts of Fire and Security and the Building Technology Group were put together into the Fire and Building Technology Group. And as I say, Julie was responsible for that, and I reported to Julie, who in turn reported to Debbie.
Okay. And can you tell us, why did you leave the BRE in May 2019?
A long list of reasons. Having dealt with Grenfell for the police since the day of the fire, there were a lot of pressures around that. It's difficult to describe, and I don't want to compromise the police investigation that's ongoing either. But my team and I, the people that reported to me and myself, we spent the most part of a year not really at BRE. We went to Grenfell and did what we did each day, and excavated and took the tower apart, or the evidence from the tower. And then returning to BRE, there was an expectation of going back to growing the business and trying to grow the team and hiring more people, which with it came expectations about income growth and so on. And I felt that I was being stretched too thin. Kira was the same. Yeah. We ended up spending most of our days, dealing with the needs of junior staff, which is no criticism of them. They need input, and that's absolutely fair enough for them. But then spending the nights doing our own job and trying to keep up with the rigours of things. And so by beginning of 2019, I think, the decision was it was untenable. There were also again, discussions ongoing with the Met about various things which
Okay, you don't need to go
inquiry is
into.
dealing with.
And is it right that after leaving the BRE, you've set up your own partnership, GCCH Experts LLP, with Chiara Holland?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, we don't need to go to it, but Chiara Holland tells us in her witness statement that she joined your department in October 2012, and I think you've just confirmed that. Is that correct?
Yes, that sounds correct. Yes.
And she reported to you throughout, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And do you still work together at DCCH Experts?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, just going back to the management and reporting structure at the BRE, let's just look briefly at Chiara Holland's witness statement. That's BRE 30/43829. And I want to look at page 4 and paragraph 13. She says this: when I joined BRE, Debbie Smith was Director of Fire Sciences and subsequently became Managing Director of BRE Global Limited, of which Fire Sciences and Building Products was part. Fire investigation was one of the teams within Fire Sciences and Building Products. The overall department changed names several times during my time at BRE, with some sections moving into and out of the department, and the management structure changing slightly as a result. But it was my understanding that the fire investigation team ultimately reported to Dr. Smith. However, when Dr. Smith became Managing Director, Dr. Julie Bragula became the Director of Fire Sciences and Building Products. Dr. Smith was the Contract Manager, Project Director QA for all fire safety-related government research projects, and ultimately approved bids and proposals, and also approved many fire research reports. Now, does that description there accord with your understanding?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, I think it's consistent with some of the evidence you've already given. And so Debbie Smith had ultimate responsibility for all fire safety-related government research projects. Is that correct?
That was my understanding, yes.
Yeah. Did that include reports and the work done under the Investigation of Real Fires project, which we will come on to with you
Yes,
later?
it did, though. So from memory, Debbie was directly involved in the bidding process. So for each contract, when it was renewed, when it came to signing off reports, she delegated that responsibility to Corinne Williams.
I see. So does that mean she wouldn't actually read the reports that were produced under that Investigation of Real Fires project?
Sometimes she would, but I think by exception rather than norm.
Right, I see. I mean, were there particular circumstances in which she would read them?
Yes, we did, on occasion, if there was something that was interacting with, say, another area of research, then we might specifically ask for Debbie's input to make sure that things were aligned, because you'd be aware that there were other activities going on in BRE, but you wouldn't necessarily be appraised of all the detail.
Yeah, but she'd have the overview, would she?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And can you describe your working relationship with Debbie Smith during your time at the BRE from 2006 to May 2019?
It was a good relationship. She interviewed me, I think, with David Charters before I started. I got on well with Debbie. She was not without challenges. Everyone has their own, way of doing things. But broadly speaking, I got on well with her.
Yeah. Did she ever supervise directly any aspects of your fire investigation or research work at any time?
Yes, during the period when I was reporting to her when she was my line manager.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I want to move on now to some questions about the structure and organisation of the BRE during your time there. If we can look at your third witness statement at page 5. And at paragraph 24 on that page at the bottom there, you say this. You say, the BRE I joined in 2006 still had strong ties to government, since most of the personnel had previously been civil servants working at the former agency. All the research carried out by BRE needed to be directly related to a commission from a client, whether that client was a national or local government, a private client, or the BRE trust. And then you say this, I believe, created tensions. Now, can you just help us? What kind of tensions did this create?
I think I come on to this later in the statement. It was really around the point that the people in fire safety, they were all committed enthusiastic research scientists. You know, they wanted to understand a problem or an issue to the fullest and then provide an answer. That's what they had done, particularly those that were previously for civil servants. And I remember, and I think it was after the financial crash when this increased focus on finance came to the fore, that certain individuals struggled with that they didn't like having to stop. You know, that you've got a brief from a client that says this is the thing that we want and we're going to pay this much for it, and they're not interested in going 2 or 3 levels beyond that to really fully understand the fundamentals. And equally, there was a bit of a pushback at, you know, to the idea that you know, BRE was now a fee-earning, or the Fire Safety Group was now a fee-earning organisation, that projects needed to generate a profit. You know, as part of my role, particularly later on, I became acutely aware of how the finance is balanced, that you need ultimately to have fee-earning projects that generate a margin, even if only to break even after you've paid for building rent, maintenance, admin, so on and so forth, for the business to survive. But there were some people that struggled with that and, you know, felt that anything beyond breaking even on a project wasn't okay. They felt there was a moral issue with that.
Yeah.
And
in terms of who the tensions were between, who the groups were between, who was it that was still wanting to pursue projects that might be loss-making, that might only break even? You talk about research scientists. I mean, who are you talking about? Particular groups within BRE?
Not groups as such, just, again, individuals that had been part of the civil service role. I remember Kelvin Annable was a particularly passionate person. You know, he wanted to do the right thing, and he struggled with the idea. I remember having conversations about that with him, and there were others. I remember, I forget who, but certain members of the computer modelling group, for instance, were also very sort of dyed-in-the-wall civil servants that just wanted to do the job without constraint in that way.
Yeah. And I mean, you've talked a little bit about the evolution of your approach to your work, but where would you say you sat in relation to such tensions?
I would say my position evolved. I was very much on the side of, when I was a junior, a consultant doing these research projects, I just wanted to do more research projects and more and better research. It was a reality of the job, the organisation, that ultimately you becoming more mature in life, you realise that you've got to do certain things a certain way, otherwise there won't be a future in it. So it's, as I say, something that evolved. Yeah.
So is it fair to say, as you became more senior and you had more responsibility, you had to take cognizance of the commercial pressures on the BRE more and more?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, you have described this in a bit more detail. If we look at page 7 in this statement, at paragraph 31, you say this. You say, 2008 was the time of the financial crisis. I recall a lot more focus being placed upon the financial health of the fire safety group. During the regular monthly meetings, there were concerns raised by management that some staff apparently viewed the need to generate profit on projects as a problem. Further, there was a tendency for some staff to pursue areas of interest or pet projects that did not form part of the objectives set by the client. This appeared to stem from the culture that had existed when BRE was part of government, and staff were therefore able to make their own cases for pursuing new areas of research. Where this occurred, these projects either broke even or made a loss. The reality was that it was necessary for fee-earning projects to generate profit so that BRE's overheads could be met, buildings, utilities, non-fee-earning staff, and there would be funds remaining, i.e. an overall profit margin, to pass to the BRE Trust. Now, in the first line, you're talking there about a lot more focus being placed on the financial health of the fire safety group at the time. By whom was that being imposed?
Predominantly Debbie Smith and Stephen Manchester.
Yeah.
So the fire safety group had, I believe it was a monthly meeting, something of that order in terms of frequency, just a catch up for the group on projects and so on. And there were a number, and I forget what number, but that Debbie came in on, and correctly, had to make the point that things needed to change to secure the financial viability of the group.
Yeah. And so where you refer to management in line 3, you say there were, during those meetings, concerns raised by management that staff viewed the need to generate profit on projects as a problem. Are you referring there to Debbie Smith and Stephen Manchester?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, was it your understanding at the time that the BRE itself was in financial difficulty?
Probably yes. I don't think I was hugely aware of it. As with my progression, it was my awareness of these things increased as time progressed and my financial responsibility increased. I do remember at some point early during my career, there was, for instance, the switch of the pension fund arrangements that caused a bit of an uproar because BRE had used the civil service pensions for a long time, and that caused financial problems because there's a big financial burden that comes with that, and so it switched over to a stakeholder pension scheme.
Yeah.
And yes, there were. I remember, meetings again, annual. I forget if it was described as the annual conference or business update, whatever. It was a look through the group's finances as a whole, and the point tended to be made that profits were very slim compared with the overall turnover of the business. I mean, I think at that time, the BRE group turnover was probably something to the tune of 40 to 45 million, and profits, if and when they occurred, were in the hundreds of thousands. It certainly wasn't a seriously profitable business.
Right, yeah. Now, you talked about these discussions taking place at the regular monthly meetings. Were there any other particular steps that were taken by management to ensure that BRE employees were aware that fee-earning projects needed to generate a profit? Do you recall anything concrete happening?
I don't, but that's probably because I wouldn't have been exposed to those conversations at the time. I expect, because I wasn't managing serious projects at that point. I think there might have been a reference to conversations with project managers about making sure they were doing what they needed to do. Yep. But I wouldn't have been privy to those at that time.
Yeah. Now, if we can look at page 9 now of this third witness statement and paragraph 35, you say there, in my experience, there was a fractious relationship between large-scale cladding testing and research. Each belonged to a separate business unit, one within standard testing and the other not. The various business units in BRE were, in my experience, set up in indirect competition with one another. We were seeking different types of work and clients, but ultimately competing for the same resources, such as laboratory space. Now, just to help us here, can you just expand on what you mean there in the first lines by a fractious relationship between large-scale cladding testing and research?
The short answer is we got in each other's way, I suppose, to a large extent within the burn hall. And as I mentioned earlier, there were those of us that were very passionate about the research and wanted the most for the research, and there were others whose interests were in large-scale testing, and you couldn't physically fit all the activities that we wanted to fit in the burn hall into the burn hall.
Yeah. And when you're talking about large-scale testing, are you talking predominantly about large-scale testing for private clients?
Yes. When I say testing, I will try at least to be referring to standard tests, something to a British standard or a European standard, with a predefined pass-fail. And large-scale testing, so the large-scale tests that occurred in the burn hall were the 8414 test. Yeah. There were also various suppression-related tests where they looked at distribution of sprinkler systems, how much water ended up in various parts of a sprinkler head's throw. And others. There was a gas suppression rig also within an annex to the burn hall. I'm sorry, I can't list all of the various
that's
tests,
fine.
but those are examples of the sorts of things that were going on that were not research. They were testing products for private clients. Yeah.
And so you said that one manifestation of that was that you were just getting in each other's way because you all wanted the space in the burn hall. Were there any other manifestations of those tensions?
There were some heated discussions, I would say, but then there was an odd... I think And I only have very limited direct experience of this, but part of, I think, what the senior management at BRE, so I'm talking above Debbie at the time, Martin Wyatt, Carol Atkinson, probably Peter Bonfield to an extent as well, they were, I think, as part of this strategy to try and move people out of the civil service mindset, they were fostering a fairly competitive culture within BRE, that businesses would be compared against each other, and we would talk about how one business was doing well this month and another business not so well. And
Yeah.
it's great when you're doing well, but it's not so much when you're not, and people will try and fight for their corner.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
Can you tell with this, you've drawn this distinction between the testing work and what we might call the research work. Who was responsible for instigating or generating the research side, and how did that come about?
In terms of winning the work, do you mean?
Well, was it a case of winning work from third parties, or was it internally generated by someone saying, I think we ought to look into this or that?
I see. So in terms of the government frameworks, which I think I've touched on in various points, those were generally overseen by Debbie Smith. She was the framework director, I believe.
But they would be generated by government.
They would be generated by government.
We'd like you to look at this or that.
Yes.
Was all the research work generated by some outside request for?
Not all of it, no. So alongside the government work, there were private clients who would come with a need, and BRE being what it was, we'd get some fairly unusual questions, and might have to devise a programme of research on how to answer that question. And then equally there was the BRE Trust research, which was self-generated. So there was I believe it was an annual, or it might have been a biannual process wherein the trust would open itself up to bids effectively from staff, so that staff would be encouraged to try and think of new areas of research that they had to meet a number of criteria. So, things that government was unlikely to commission, things that we felt would make a positive impact on the built environment as a whole. And yes, so as far as that was concerned, there was, and I will say it was a modest funding available given the issues with profitability, but there was a certain amount of funding available to do those kinds of research. And one of the first projects I was involved in was around the evacuation of people from hospitals, so people with various levels of mobility impairment depending on why they'd arrived at hospital. That was all funded by the BRE Trust. That was a self-identified piece of work that needed to be done for the public good.
So research in response to requests from third parties could, presumably, if costed correctly, turn a profit.
Yes, absolutely.
But obviously the internal research would not.
No, there was it was certainly possible that you might underspend on a BRE Trust piece of work, but there was a stricter focus, I suppose is the best way of putting it, on making sure that you'd price the thing absolutely, without a margin from the outset, and that once you'd finished the work, you were left with nothing, effectively.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Can I just clarify one point? Can you just help us? It's right, isn't it, that after the BRE was privatised in 1997, the BRE had to bid for all government work, didn't it?
That's my understanding, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Now, we were looking at your description of a fractious relationship between large-scale cladding testing and research. For how long did that fractious relationship continue? Did that remain the case until you left the BRE in May 2019?
Yes, it did.
And can you help us? Who were the employees that were involved in that fractious relationship that you're describing at senior level?
Steve Howard was had spiky moments. I mean, I was able to get on well with him at times, but equally there were a few more heated exchanges at other times. In terms of cladding, I suppose he was probably the main person, because he took quite a lot of responsibility for the cladding in spite of his role as business group manager and later director of Passive Fire.
Yeah. So there was tension between Stephen Howard in his role relating to large-scale cladding testing, yes, versus who? Who was on the research side of that?
Well, Stephen Manchester was
Yeah.
business group manager for fire safety. The two of them shared an office, funnily enough. But yes, there would be, various debates about when we can and can't do things. I should say, in addition to the senior management, there was also, at various times, and I will struggle to say when, but there were burn hall groups sort of set up where all the various customers, if you like, internal customers of the BRE burn hall would try and hold meetings to try and coordinate when the various things in the burn hall were going to take place and what could actually be accommodated or not. But again, everyone was fighting their corner to a certain extent in that.
Yeah. And where did Debbie Smith sit in terms of that fractious relationship between large-scale cladding testing and research?
She was trying to keep the peace and make sure that, what was ultimately concluded was the best for the organisation as a whole.
Yeah. And what about Sarah Colwell?
Sarah probably, and again, apologies, I will struggle with dates. Early on in my career, she was part of, I think she headed up reaction to fire. So her and Steve Howard were both in the reaction to fire / passive part of the business, so testing for things like BS 476 Part 7 tests, but equally the larger furnace tests. That was shared between them. Sarah later moved to suppression, and again, apologies, I can't recall when off the top of my head.
No, so
So she was involved to an extent with those, although the burn hall user group meetings, they would tend to be more junior members of staff than Sarah, Steve or Debbie that were attending to try and resolve things. But I'm sure she would have been involved in various discussions with the two Stephens and Debbie about
I see.
how and when things would be fitted into the burn hall.
Yeah. So she was trying to manage these tensions, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you've talked a little bit about the fact that, for example, monthly performance figures were shown, and that was one of the ways in which people were set up in indirect competition with one another. Were there any other examples of that you can give us?
No, I mean, not from that side of things. There was the Friday update about hearing about various parts of the business, and it would become very obvious which parts of the business are doing better than others, but that wasn't the intent behind those meetings. It was just part of what you realise is going on in other parts of the business. Okay.
Now, I want to move on now to some questions about some particular definitions and fire classifications, and just reminding ourselves that you joined the BRE in October 2006. When did you first become familiar with the sections of the building regulations which are relevant to fire, and in particular external fire spread?
In terms of approved document B as a whole, setting aside external fire spread for a moment, I became aware of it, and I suppose I was forced into it, probably deliberately, through being involved in the drafting of HTM, so healthcare technical memoranda guidance for hospitals, about construction of hospitals. I was involved in drafting Part J of 05-03 of the HTMs. And equally, I was briefly involved in drafting of BB 100, which is Building Bulletin 100, which was a design guide for schools. So those pieces of work, and again, I believe probably intentionally, forced me to try and dissect approved document B to understand what it's trying to achieve, to then be part of the team that was working on how to construct relevant guidance for these specific types of buildings. In terms of external fire spread, my first exposure, I think, was Curl Street, was the fire I attended with Sarah Colwell. That's where I was first introduced to the concept of the 8414 test, in a real sense. I'd seen the rigs in the burn hall.
And can you remember the date that you were first involved with that?
In Curl Street?
Yeah.
Apologies, it's in my statement.
Yeah, okay.
If we went to it, I could tell you about it.
Don't worry, we'll find it.
Yeah.
Now, I asked you, my question was actually about the building regulations themselves as distinct from the approved documents. Okay. No, it's fine, but can I just check that you did understand there to be a difference between the functional requirements in the building regulations and the practical guidance that you see in, for example, approved document B?
Yes, that was explained very early on. Something I remember attending, I believe, during my first 12 months at BRE was a conference launching the new approved document B. because that came into effect, I believe, April 2007,
Correct.
2006 edition.
Yeah.
And there was a roadshow that government were doing, and it came to BRE, and we were all obviously asked to go and sit in and hear from, at that time I think it was Anthony Bird and Brian Martin, what the developments were and how the whole structure of the regulations and the approved documents fitted together, and what we were doing that contributed to that.
So at that point, you became familiar with the 2007 or the 2006 version, published in 2007 version of ADB, yes?
Yes.
And
I would have almost certainly been looking at the 2000 edition prior to then. But
I was about to say,
just dipping into it rather than having any formal input.
Yeah, so you did have some familiarity with approved document B in its previous iterations.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, what about National Class Naught? When did you first come to understand that classification in any detail?
In terms of really seriously understanding it, it was probably during the course of the Lakanal House fire. And I mean, Martin Shipp, was mentoring me through the early part of that investigation.
Yeah.
And yes, I think that was the time when I first really got into the nuts and bolts of how Class O works.
Yeah, right, got you. Now, I want to ask you a little bit about your knowledge of the background to National Class Naught. Now, can we agree that that classification can be achieved by combining particular results from two British standard tests, BS 476 Part 7 and BS 476 Part 6?
Yes.
Now, turning first to Part 7, that's essentially a surface spread of flame test, yes?
Yes, agreed.
Now, what's your understanding about the origins of that test?
It first appeared in BS 476 before it was split into parts, and I'm probably going to get the dates wrong. I believe there was a 1932 edition and a 1953 edition. It certainly appeared in the 1953 edition. It may, I forget, it may have appeared in the 32 edition as well.
And what did you understand when it first became a test and a thing? What did you understand it to be testing in relation to?
My understanding is it was developed for internal linings. It was looking at the rate of flame spread that you might achieve under different incident heat fluxes. So the way the test was set up with a specimen that is perpendicular to a furnace face, that in and of itself creates a gradient of heat flux across the sample, which is most intense nearest the furnace and decreases as you move away from the furnace face. And then you can correlate the speed and extent to which flame spreads across the surface with those heat fluxes, although in practice, in terms of users of the approved documents, or indeed the building regulations pre the 1984 Act, users were just interested in what class they achieved. So they would get classes 1 to 4, depending upon the extent of flame spread, which would then, via either, again, the regulations pre-84 or the approved documents post-84, the classes would be equated with certain areas of surfaces on buildings.
Yeah. Dr. Crowder, we're going to come on to how users of the approved document might have understood Class Naught in just a moment. I'm just interested in establishing your understanding and some basics about those tests. Can we agree that it was established as a method for testing flame spread within corridors, within buildings?
Yes, agreed.
And can we agree as well that there have been no fundamental changes to the Part 7 test since its initial development?
Agreed. No fundamental changes.
Yeah. So the reference scenario for that test is an internal fire, yes?
Yes.
And it is testing a horizontal progression of flame. Is that correct?
Agreed, yes.
So it's not testing vertical spread of flame, is it?
No, it isn't.
Now, turning now to BS 476 Part 6, that's the fire test for fire propagation, yes?
Yes.
How would you define fire propagation if someone asked you in the street, what is fire propagation? What's your definition?
It's analogous to heat release rate or energy that is released by a specimen or the surface of a specimen. It isn't ultimately the heat release rate because all that the test measures is temperature change.
Yeah.
But what the test does, so you have a calibration run, which is run with a non-combustible blank specimen, and then you have your test run.
Yep.
And the indices that arise from the fire propagation test, again, they're analogous to the amount of energy that's being produced by the test specimen as
Yes.
compared with a non-combustible specimen, but they don't give you any direct information as to exactly how much energy is being produced.
Yeah, I understand. Now, what's your understanding about the origins of that Part 6 fire propagation test?
I don't know its original development as well as the Part 7 test. I believe it was introduced later. I may be wrong, I don't think it appeared in the undivided BS 476. I think it first appeared as Part 6 to the standard.
Yeah. So, did you ever come to know that it was developed for and intended to test fire propagation within a compartment?
Yes.
You knew that?
Yes.
So both of these tests have an internal fire as their reference scenario, in
Yes.
short.
Agreed.
Neither were designed or intended to test an external cladding fire scenario, were they?
Agreed.
Now, in light of that, can you just help us in general terms? What is the relevance of these tests to assessing the risk of external fire spread in the event of a cladding fire?
My understanding, I wasn't directly involved in this, but my understanding is that there was some work done, and I can't claim to have seen the work, but the issue of interest was the amount of heat flux that, so if a fire occurs in a room and the window to that room fails, you get flame extension out of the building and you will get heat flux back onto the walls, the external walls of the building immediately above that window. I believe that there was a belief, and again, I haven't seen the detail, but that that level of heat flux was comparable with the room fire itself, particularly in areas close to where the flames were emitting from the window. And that was the rationale for using these tests in that way. But again, I don't have direct information on that.
And when you're talking about this belief and the rationale, can you remember which scientist it was at the BRE that was involved in working this out, or what period of time we're talking about?
No, apologies. I remember it being explained to me. It may have been Martin Shipp, it may have been Brian Martin. So I remember getting the explanation, but I couldn't tell you who did that work, sorry.
So is it right that you've never had a proper explanation provided to you as to precisely why Class 0 is used as a metric for assessing the risk of external fire spread in the event of a cladding fire?
Correct, yeah.
Do you consider that National Class 0 has been at any time an appropriate measure of the fire performance for external cladding?
When the issue, if you like, was first conceived, then I can understand the argument for using an existing test and trying to make best use of it, albeit in a slightly different application using these sorts of principles. But I would say that, certainly by the time of ADB 2006, when, we were several years into European harmonisation, for instance, I really struggle to see why Class O was retained. I think I did. I gave evidence on the appropriateness or otherwise of Class O as opposed to the European tests during the evidence I gave in Singapore in the Supreme Court back in 2015.
And can you just summarise for us what was the gist of your evidence about the appropriateness of retaining Class 0 as opposed to
my principal concern
European?
My principal concern was it doesn't deal with composite behaviour very well. That was a case that concerned composite roof panels because the Singapore Fire Safety Code has Class 0 enshrined within it in relation to various products. And there was a debate about the European test methods as opposed to the UK, the national methods, and the appropriateness or otherwise of each. I don't support Class O as a test. I understand that there are political motivations as to why it was retained. but those are political, they're not technical.
We may come on to this later, but I just want to tease this out now. When you say, I don't support Class Naught, did you ever make that clear to government and the department, as in the department that used to be...
I remember asking the question, probably of Brian Martin, and being told, it's part of the... what's the word I'm looking for? The side-by-side application of the harmonised European standards and the old national standards, and there was a desire to discontinue reliance upon Class O at some point in the future. But I remember being told there were, industry interests, products that were on the market as a result of achieving Class O that would cease to be on the market if Class O ceased to be a viable option.
Yeah.
I wasn't privy to that,
Right.
what was going on, but I remember being told, that it's a thing which is understood as being a weakness, but it's not something that will continue in perpetuity. It's part of this transition, but ultimately the transition never concluded in the proper way.
And can you help us, just breaking this down, when did you have that conversation with Brian Martin where you explained your concerns and he explained that there were certain reasons for retaining it?
Probably fairly early on in my career. I would say around the time that he moved to government, to DCLG. So that would have been, 2008, I suppose. It was early. But it was, as I said, there was a recognition, was my understanding, that Class O wasn't the ideal tool in the box, but that it wasn't going to be there forever.
Yeah. And did you ever raise it with him again and ask him why the transition period hadn't come to an end and Class Naught abandoned in favour of, for example, the Euro classes?
No, but by then I did, how do I put this? The writing was on the wall in terms of advances in fire safety and research and things not being changed in the approved documents unless you could find things to delete. So I knew it wasn't going to be a fruitful line of inquiry, let's put it that way.
So is your evidence that despite remaining concerned about it, you never raised it with Brian Martin? What, because you knew the answer would be no?
I wouldn't say I never raised... we knew there was a shared understanding that Class O is what it is and it's not ideal. And that ultimately it would come to an end. But that end got extended and extended and extended. And I mean, it's in some of my evidence, government, and I'm not talking about Brian Martin, I'm talking about people he reported to. They weren't in listening mode at this point. It was... fire safety was very much in decline at that stage, I would suggest.
And how did you know these people above Brian Martin weren't in listening mode? How did you come to be aware of that?
Conversations, things that he, let slip, I suppose, during phone calls about research. I remember there was probably, I think it was during the external fire spread work, which I know we'll come on to later, but this point that government A isn't commissioning any new research, and for whatever reason, and don't get me wrong, I don't think Brian Martin agreed with this, but they weren't going to accept anyone else's research either. They just weren't open to new ideas on how to do things.
And you talked about there being a shared understanding that Class Naught wasn't ideal, but you had to live with it. Who was that shared understanding between?
So when I said that, I meant Brian Martin and me in terms of those conversations. I think, I suspect others also had that shared understanding that it is, it's an outdated standard and it needs to go. The question is when.
Did you ever discuss that difficulty with other colleagues within BRE?
I probably discussed it with Ciara Holland at some point, just as part of, explaining to her the regulations, the approved documents and so on and how they work. No, I don't think... sorry, I'm double checking myself. I'm not sure is the answer. It may well have come up. if it had come up, it would have been during project review meetings, that kind of thing, as opposed to sort of general chit-chat.
Okay. And do you ever recall a time when either you or anyone else from the BRE actually reinforced the urgency of getting rid of National Class Naught in terms of public safety? Did that ever happen?
I believe there was something linked to, and it was, apologies, it wasn't part of, it was covered by standard testing and Debbie Smith to a degree. There was some work done, is it radar? There was a project that looked at the European versus the national
Yeah.
standards and the pros and cons of each. When that occurred, I can't say, apologies. I know that there were other conversations ongoing, but they didn't involve me.
But was it your understanding that during the course of that project, the BRE made clear that there would be public safety ramifications of allowing Class Naught to remain as a metric for the measurement of external fire spread?
I don't know whether they did.
You don't know? Okay. Mr. Chairman, I think that might be a good moment for our break, because
Yes.
I'm going to stay with Class Naught, but I'm moving on to a
All right.
different subtopic.
Well, we'll take a break at this point. You probably know, Dr. Crowder, we have a break during each session. We'll take it now. We'll stop and resume, please, at 11:30. And now you've started giving your evidence, as I've said to all the other witnesses. Please don't talk about it to your evidence or anything relating to it to anyone while you're out of the room. All right? Thank you very much. Would you like to go with the usher, please? Thank you very much. 11:30, please. Would you ask Dr. Crowder to come back in, please? All right, Dr. Crowder, ready to carry on?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank
Mrs.
you.
Strange.
Yes, just a couple of questions picking up on the evidence just before the break. Can you help us with this? Did Dr. Debbie Smith, did she also have the shared understanding that you talked about, your understanding between you and Brian Martin, that Class Naught was far from ideal and would be replaced at some point?
I would presume so, but that would be a presumption.
Why would you
Given-
presume so?
She had a lot of involvement in the development of the European tests, was my understanding, and how they compared with the national tests.
Yeah. And did you ever come to know what might replace National Class Naught if ever that transition did actually happen?
My understanding was that the European classes under 13501 Part 1 were intended to fully replace Class Naught and indeed the other classes against BS 476 Part 7.
And what about for buildings over 18 metres? Was it just to be a European classification, or was, for example, BS 84 testing going to be part of what was in the relevant guidance?
I don't think, pre-Grenfell, I don't think there was ever a view that BS 8414 was in need of significant review. Obviously, it needed its periodic updates and so on. But I don't recall any concerns being raised about BS 8414 prior to Grenfell.
Yes, no, I'm not really talking about concerns, but thinking back to the Parliamentary Select Committee in 1999, were you aware of that?
Dimly. It's before my time. Dimly aware of it.
I see.
It's before my
Okay.
time.
In which case, if you're dimly aware of it, I won't ask you about that. We'll ask some of your other colleagues about that. But staying with National Class Naught for a moment, I want to look at your third witness statement now. That's BRE 3047668, page 32. And at paragraph 133, there you say this. You say, in my opinion, Professor Bisbee has misread Approved Document B's definition of Class Naught, despite including it and its precursors in his report. The definition states, the highest national performance classification for lining materials is Class Naught. This is achieved if a material or the surface of a composite product is either A, composed throughout of materials of limited combustibility, or B, a Class 1 material which has a fire propagation index, I, of not more than 12, etc., etc. That's referring to the 476 Part 6 and Part 7 tests, yes?
Yes.
Now, that is the definition of National Class Naught from paragraph 13 of Appendix A of Approved Document B, yes?
Yes.
And in that paragraph of your witness statement where you set out the definition from within that appendix of the approved document, we can see you've underlined certain words. You've underlined the surface of a composite product, and then you've underlined composed throughout of materials of limited combustibility, yes?
Yes.
And you go on to explain, if we can go below that to paragraph 134, you explain, you say this, the underlined text above means, in my opinion, that an ACM panel, or indeed any composite product, which has a surface formed throughout of any of the metals which are deemed to be non-combustible, including aluminium, zinc, copper, and any alloys of these, meet the definition for Class Naught without the need for testing, provided they do not have a surfaced coating. Yes?
Yes.
Now, just leaving aside Professor Bisbee's opinion for the moment and concentrating on yours, first, has what you've described in those paragraphs always been your understanding of the definition of National Class Naught as set out in the approved document?
No.
What other view have you held about the interpretation of the definition of National Class Naught?
My understanding developed further from what I'd had previously during the drafting of PAS 9980, which is the new standard for assessing the fire safety of cladding.
Just pause there.
Sorry.
And can you just perhaps try and speak slightly more slowly, because I think sometimes you're going quite fast. So PAS 9980, as you say, is the new standard for assessing the fire safety of cladding. That came out very recently, didn't it?
Yes.
In January 2022, is that right?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Yes. So you're saying, is this right, that your understanding of the definition of national class naught changed during the course of your work on that
Yes.
PAS standard, yes?
Yes.
Can you just explain how it changed?
I hadn't fully appreciated, and apologies, could we return to the previous page with the definition
Yes,
up
please.
on the screen?
So if we look at the bottom of page 32. And you want to blow up paragraph 133, yes?
Yes. I had not previously appreciated the significance of the underlined text in the first partial paragraph, the point about the surface of a composite product. I had previously held the view that effectively you could get Class O provided the product as a whole was limited combustibility. I hadn't fully understood the nuance about the surface, that all it takes is to put a metal sheet onto something and you get a Class O, and that was raised, I forget when, during the various steering group discussions for the development of the PAS, and it took me a bit to process, but I fully accept that is ultimately what the text says.
I see. And was that a surprise to you when you realised that it could be read that way, or that those words were there and that's what you thought it meant?
Yes, it was. Because my background is obviously from within BRE, it's fire engineering and so on, and having the benefit of the steering group with the PAS was this diverse range of views that we had from industry as to what the issues were that needed to be addressed in terms of cladding. And yes, it took me by surprise, but ultimately when you read it and reread it, that is ultimately what it says. There is, to my mind, it's not something that necessarily jumps off the page, and I certainly don't criticise Professor Bisbee for not having seen it, because there were many years when I didn't. But it's there, and it is possible for a user of approved document B, depending upon their background, to reach that conclusion, that all they need to do is put a metal sheet onto a composite product and they will have a Class O product.
Right. Do you ever recall hearing that view being advanced by anybody prior to your work on the PAS
No.
9980 standard? So that wasn't a view that ever got discussed within the BRE?
No.
And so is it your reading now that any composite product, so long as the outer surface of that product is composed throughout of non-combustible or limited combustibility material, that any such composite product will achieve Class naught?
Yes, save that Class naught is no longer defined in the approved document.
I appreciate that, but just...
But yes, as a point of principle, yes, anything that has
Yeah.
a metal face applied to it could,
Yeah.
under the preceding editions of approved document B, be deemed to be Class naught.
And is the logic of that that you could have, for example, a piece of explosive, for example, a piece of Semtex plastic explosive, which would achieve national class naught without testing, so long as it was lined on its outer face with, for example, a 1 micron aluminium foil facer?
Yes, I mean, you've picked an extreme example, but yes, that is the corollary of what is in this text.
I see. And if you're right, are you saying that, for example, an ACM PE polyethylene composite panel could be national class naught without any need for testing, provided the outer layer was pure aluminium and didn't have a paint or surface coating?
Correct.
Now, you're presumably aware that for many years and until after the fire, the guidance in approved document B in relation to the external surfaces of buildings directed that the provisions of diagram 40 were to be followed, yes?
Yes.
And you're presumably familiar with the provisions of diagram 40, is that correct?
Yes.
And that for any habitable story over 18 metres, the external surfaces of the walls were to be national class naught or Euro class B, yes?
Yes, save that it's the overall height of the building that needs to be over 18 metres on diagram 40 for class 0. The
Yes.
habitable story is referred to at paragraph 12.7.
Yes, I see. So you never came to have any discussions with anybody in government about the potential ramifications of having a definition of class 0 that had this ability to achieve class 0 simply if the surface was composed of materials of limited combustibility. That's not a conversation you had?
No.
And that's not a public safety issue that you ever raised with government?
Well, I wasn't aware of it, so no. It is now, it has been raised because government were part of the discussions with the steering group on the PAS, and the PAS has taken a far more restrictive view on class 0. So class 0 features, class O still features in the PAS, in that, you know, we're dealing with historic buildings in that document, but it's only deemed to be reliable in relation to homogeneous materials.
Yeah. What specifically was it that led you to revisit this guidance and read and reread it as you've described and then come to this view?
The discussions during the steering group meetings of the PAS
I
standard.
see. And were there any particular organisations or individuals within the steering group that were advancing this definition, albeit with potentially extreme consequences?
Yes, CWCT.
Right. They were the one putting this definition forward.
Yes.
Yeah, I see. Have you ever discussed your understanding of this definition with any other fire safety professionals outside the PAS 9980 group?
Not as yet. I'm due to, because now the PAS is out in the world. People are asking for explanations, but no, not as yet.
I see.
Because it's only been very recently published.
Yeah. Now we're going to come back to some more.
I'm sorry to interrupt you
Yeah.
again, Miss Grange.
Yeah,
Try
no.
to stop doing it so often. But I understand what you're saying about the construction of these words, but there is something slightly odd, isn't there, about the use of the expression composed throughout of materials in the plural if you're only referring to the surface, the final exterior surface.
Agreed. It's
Well, that might
it's
suggest-
not great writing, if I'm
No.
brutally honest.
Might it suggest that what A is really referring to is the material which is referred to in the previous sentence?
It's possible, and that was my original reading of the text.
Oh, right.
But, as I say, having been confronted with this proposition, and it's a similar debate to that in relation to paragraph 12.7. The point is there is room for interpretation, and I don't, you know, as much as it worries me, I don't. What's the word? I don't think it's unreasonable for people with you know different backgrounds to arrive at those different interpretations.
Well, perhaps we can agree it's not the best piece of drafting.
At that we can agree. Yes. So.
Thank you very much, anyway.
Yeah,
Yes, Miss
thank you.
Grange.
As far as you are aware from the discussions that you've described at this steering group, are there organisations or individuals within industry who've always read the definition as you now do and applied it? For example, in the way that I gave.
I'm afraid I don't know whether they had always held that view or whether it was a recent development. All I know is that it was brought to the steering group for discussion.
Okay. Now, we'll come back to some more questions later about National Class 0. Moving on now to the Euroclass system, can we agree that these were introduced into the UK in 2002 as a result of the European Construction Products Directive? Yes.
Yes.
And the classification standard which explains how, for example, Euroclass B is derived is EN 13501 Part 1. Is that correct?
Yes, agreed.
Now, if we just turn to that British standard, it's at BSI 401738 at page 40. There we have Table 1 on page 40, which sets out the classification criteria. Now, looking at that, we can see that the various classes rely not just on one test, but on a combination of different tests. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the various classes from A2 down to D, they all require testing to EN 13823, yes?
Yes.
And that's the single burning item test.
Yes.
Now, can we agree that the single burning item test was, in basic terms, introduced to replace the room corner test by providing a method where the results of that test could be inferred without incurring the same cost in time and money?
That's my understanding, yes.
When did you come to have that understanding about the single burning item test?
I don't know, sorry. It would be later on in my career. It wasn't sort of one of the very first things that I learnt about. So BRE had an ISO 9705 room, which was the standard room for this room corner test. And yes, at some point it was the link was made clear to me that it had been used as the means of establishing the various classes that were related to the time to achieve flashover in that standardised room. But I'm sorry, I couldn't say exactly when I learnt of that link.
No, that's fine. But I think we can agree that as with the national classification system that we looked at, the reference scenario is a fire within a room, yes?
As originally developed, yes, that's my understanding.
Yeah. Do you consider that this test is useful for assessing the fire behaviour in circumstances far removed from that test scenario, for example, on the external face of a high-rise building?
It can be, but only when used in, and again, apologies, my memory is going to fail me, there is a European assessment document, an EAD, which describes in quite some detail, it's a fairly painful document to navigate, but it deals with cladding kits for the BSEN 13823 test, and it sets out the ways in which specimens should be prepared so that they are representative of the end-use condition on a cladding system, and so that the data that is then derived from the test is applicable or relevant to the cladding arrangement.
I see. So I can see that there's some guidance about how specimens are prepared so that they're representative of the end-use condition on a cladding system. But what I'm looking for is fundamentally, do you consider that this test, this single burning item test, that's derived in part from the room corner test, is a useful test for assessing external fire spread on a building?
I do, in that while I agree it was originally developed into a room corner test, my understanding is that formal specific thought has been put into making it applicable to cladding related products.
I see. But you don't know the detail of that, is that right?
No, I didn't get involved in that work, and I don't know who did. All I know is there is a European Commission document that deals with the issue.
Yeah. Now, turning now to the concept of combustibility, could you just summarise your understanding of the term limited combustibility as used in the approved document?
Yes, limited combustibility covers a range of different performances which are described in Table A7 of Appendix A of Approved Document B, Volume 2. The one that gets referred to, or the test that gets referred to most often, is the BS476 Part 11 test,
Yeah.
which, provided the temperature increase doesn't exceed 25 or 35 degrees Celsius when you plunge the specimen into the furnace at 750 degrees C, you can deem that product to be limited combustibility. There are other criteria as well that accompany that, but that's the broad.
And can you explain the difference between the concept of limited combustibility and a classification to National Class Naught?
Yes, so limited combustibility, or if I may, I'll stick with the Part 11 test first. It's only deals with individual materials. It is very difficult, albeit not impossible, to try and prepare a specimen for that test out of anything other than a purpose-made cylinder of material for dropping into the furnace. And so it is, and if I may, it's somewhat analogous to, and there's a similar separation, if you like, as with the fire propagation test, where I said before, the fire propagation doesn't directly tell you about energy release, it tells you about temperature, but it can be interrelated with energy release. So the limited combustibility test also tells you about energy release, and given the severity of conditions it imposes, it has some links with the bomb calorimeter test in terms of, again, understanding energy output. But that is what it is. It tells you how much energy, again, indirectly via a temperature measurement, a material will produce when exposed to very severe heat.
And how is that different from the National Class Naught tests, thinking back to 476 Part 6 and Part 7?
Those tests are surface-based tests. Only the exposed surface is exposed. There are, particularly in relation to composite products, a number of weaknesses associated with them, chiefly with the Part 7 test. The main weakness I've encountered is the use of the water-cooled specimen holder, so that even if you have, and I'll take polyethylene ACM as a prime example, if you place a sample of polyethylene ACM into a Part 7 rig,
Yeah.
as has been done since the Grenfell fire, the heat will conduct through the aluminium face and will melt the polyethylene within the panel, but as soon as that polyethylene starts to flow and reach the edges of the water-cooled frame, they are cooled, they re-solidify, they never get exposed to the furnace, and you don't therefore get an appreciation of the extent to which those underlying layers might then impact on real fire performance.
Yeah. Yes, thank
And
you.
there are similar, albeit slightly different, but similar weaknesses in the fire propagation test.
Yeah. That doesn't really test the core of the product, does it? Only
Agreed.
the surface is exposed in the frame.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, thinking back, has there been any stage in your career when you can see now that you were confused and unsure about the definitions, meanings, or relationship between National Class Naught and limited combustibility?
Yes, certainly during the early stages of my career. I mean, the example I would draw out, not that I was involved in its drafting, but I'm aware that HTM 0502, which is the healthcare memorandum for hospitals, doesn't identify limited combustibility for external walls, in spite of the fact that approved document B does. And again, hindsight, having thought back to the time when I was involved in writing the guidance, albeit the other parts of the HTM guidance, I certainly didn't appreciate the intricacies when I was first becoming acquainted with approved document B and getting involved in drafting these.
I see. And for how long did you think you perhaps didn't appreciate those intricacies?
Probably up until some point during the Lacanal investigation, because initially, again, I was being mentored, so I understood the need to do the Class O test, in that it arose directly from approved document B 2000. And it was only later, it was this whole point that's become quite a debate, obviously, around the range of materials within external wall construction that need to be limited combustibility. And then, once you appreciate that distinction, understanding the actual differences between the test methods and what they mean and what the significance of those, that came probably late on during my work on Lacanal.
Yeah. Is it possible, actually, with hindsight, that you didn't really understand those two concepts fully until after your work on the Lacanal house fire?
No, I think I'd say I learnt it part way through.
Okay.
But I didn't appreciate it. I mean, when I was attending the scene itself and doing the on-site investigation, no, I didn't have that appreciation.
Okay. Now, if we can look at your third witness statement again, at page 32, paragraph 132, and starting at the third line of that paragraph, you say this. You say, for composite products, a user of approved document B that is not a fire testing expert might reasonably, in my view, conclude that Class Naught is at least equivalent to limited combustibility particularly in relation to composite products for which it was presented as being the more relevant measure of performance. And you go on, you say, this is exemplified by the fact that for healthcare premises such as hospitals, only Class 0 or Class B as it's deemed equivalent is relied upon for external wall construction, and there is no reference to limited combustibility or Class A2 that is equivalent to the reference in approved document B. Now, I just want to break this down. Composite products that you're referring to there would include, for example, ACM, aluminium composite material products, yes?
Yes.
Now, you're referring to a fire testing expert might reasonably conclude that Class 0's at least equivalent to limited combustibility. Can you just help us? Who do you mean by a fire testing expert? And who is not a fire testing expert? Can you help us with the distinction you're drawing there?
So a fire testing expert would be someone that has carried out a lot of fire testing and understands firsthand what the respective conditions are that are imposed by each of the tests.
So someone like Sarah Colwell, for example?
Yes.
Would you class yourself as a fire testing expert?
To a point, yes. I mean, I've never been a test technician owing to the strict separation that was operated within BRE, but I've certainly witnessed and been exposed to more tests than your average construction professional.
I see. So thinking about the range of users of approved document B, would you agree that the proportion of those users who were not fire testing experts would be the vast majority?
Yes.
So building control officers, builders, architects, designers, manufacturers, yes?
Yes, agreed.
Now, can you help us? Why do you say that for composite products, Class 0 was presented as being the more relevant measure of performance? Presented where?
In paragraph 13 and an adjacent paragraph, I forget whether it's 12 or 14, within Appendix A, there is a point about composite products and the relationship to limited combustibility. There is also a reference or a note within Table A7, I think, being the limited combustibility table, that says it's a warning, in effect, that even if you have a material which is of limited combustibility, exercise caution where you have a surface coating, because in spite of meeting limited combustibility, you might not get Class O.
But isn't that merely telling readers that they're testing different things? That, for example, you might have a product that's primarily of limited combustibility, but it has a surface coating that needs to achieve Class 0, yes?
Yes, agreed.
But that's not the same as saying that what you've said here, is it? That Class 0 is presented as being the more relevant measure of performance?
Well, how do I put this? For composite products, the definitions for limited combustibility, as I said earlier, they're very difficult to actually achieve in practice. It's very difficult to prepare a specimen that will give you a representative answer on limited combustibility when you have a composite. So, and I'm, don't get me wrong, as a point of fact, as I think I've said in the statement, limited combustibility is ultimately better than Class 0. The point I'm making is that to the uninitiated reading approved document B at first blush, the warnings that exist within Appendix A, I think could again be construed in a way that leads someone to believe that Class 0 is enough and that you don't actually need to rely upon limited combustibility in all circumstances. Again, I'm not suggesting it's correct. I'm just suggesting it's an interpretation.
I just wanted to establish that with you before I consider some of your more specific arguments, whether you're saying that is a correct interpretation of approved document B.
Well, I'm sorry, let me arrive at this in a slightly different direction. With the guidance in section 12 of approved document B, we have diagram 40, which we discussed, which points to Class O. And then there is paragraph 12.7, which refers to limited combustibility. For whatever reason, doesn't refer to Class A2. It just talks about limited combustibility. And then you have these thresholds that exist with 18 metres for the overall height of the building on diagram 40 versus the height of the topmost story in paragraph 12.7. And I have, for some time wondered why have these thresholds where the figure is ultimately the same but the point of measurement is slightly out
Yes.
by a story or less.
Yeah.
If you consider diagram 40 and 12.7 in the absence of the European classes in particular, then I think we're agreed in terms of the proposition you put that they're measuring two different things,
Yeah.
and that you need to achieve both. Once you have a story above 18 metres, you must have a building above 18 metres, and therefore you need to achieve both limited combustibility and the Class O. Where things get slightly odd, and it's the reason I raise the point, is once you map the European classes onto these same diagram and paragraph, it doesn't make sense because the European classes are strictly hierarchical. You start with A1, then A2, B, and work your way down.
Yeah.
And I don't see how you can arrive at a conclusion that you would somehow have a Class B surface with Class A2 insulation, fillers, whatever the underlying construction is.
Yes.
It's a nuanced point. It's about the way that the text is put together. And again, with the experience I've had in the last year with trying to engage with more construction professionals from different backgrounds, the point is it's a view that I can understand.
Yes, yes. I mean, I understand the points you're making, I think, that parts of ADV may seem quite confusing as to why one classification applies to one part of the wall and another classification applies to another part of the wall, yes?
Yes.
I understand that, and that's a confusion that this inquiry is looking closely at. But the point you're making in your witness statement is not that it's confusing and that things could have been clearer. It's that you're saying the reasonable user of the document might consider Class 0 to be at least equivalent to limited combustibility.
Yes.
And that's the bit I'm not following as to how the points you're making signify to the user that they are equivalent. Surely, if you read the document properly, it's clear that they are different tests that you need to satisfy for Class 0 versus limited combustibility.
Save that so there's the references I previously talked about, and then there is paragraph 13, which is still on the screen. That paragraph sits within the reaction to fire section of approved document B in Appendix A, and it says the highest national product performance is Class O.
Yes, I'll come on to that point in a moment. Let's just break down the key points that you make. Actually, before we do that, did you ever express to any colleague within the BRE the view that readers of our ADB might consider those two concepts, national class 0 and limited combustibility, to be equivalent? Did you ever express that view to anyone within the BRE?
No, that arose again very recently as part of the past discussions.
And did you ever express that view to any official within government during your time at the BRE?
Not during my time at the BRE, no.
Now, I just want to take the reasons you're giving in stages. In the second half of paragraph 132 that we read, you tell us that users of the approved document who were not fire testing experts might conclude that they're equivalent, and that's exemplified by the fact that for healthcare premises such as hospitals, only Class 0 is relied upon for external wall construction, and there's no reference to limited combustibility. Now, let's just turn to that health technical memorandum. This is at INQ 3015115. We can see this is Health Technical Memorandum 0502. It's a 2015 edition, guidance in support of functional provisions, fire safety and the design of healthcare premises. And is this the type of guidance you're talking about that users of approved document B might be thinking about?
Yes,
although
there's a 2007 edition which came out at the same time as ADB 2006.
I see.
Which is more relevant in terms of when that thinking existed.
I see, okay. And I think you said that you had played some part in drafting this guidance, is that correct?
So, yeah, not in 0502. I was involved in 0503 Part J, which was the fire engineering part.
Right, I see. Just turning within this guidance for a moment to page 71 and to paragraph 6.9, it says there, surfaces of external walls. The surfaces of external walls of healthcare premises, it's the bottom of the left-hand column, should provide a surface spread of flame classification of Class 0 or European Class B. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, as you say, there's no reference in this section to limited combustibility, is there?
No, not in relation to external walls. I believe it comes up in relation to elements of structure. I think it might come up, but not specifically in relation to external walls.
But looking at that there, that doesn't exemplify the point you're making, that readers might think Class 0 is equivalent to limited combustibility, does it?
Oh, no, I wasn't saying that the guidance leads to that conclusion. I was saying that for whatever reason, which may be linked to how one reads Appendix A of Approved Document B, the authors of 0502 didn't feel it was necessary to put limited combustibility into the HTM. And I think it's well established in fire safety, fire engineering, that hospitals are sensitive buildings that are highly reliant upon the fire performance of the structure. And yet here we are, we don't have limited combustibility for hospitals.
I see. So in short, is your point that because in this healthcare guidance there's no requirement for example, the insulation to be of limited combustibility, yes, a reader of Approved Document B might think to themselves, well, because Class 0 is okay for healthcare premises, which are high-risk buildings, it must be seen as a pretty reliable and robust measure of performance of external fire spread.
Yes.
That's your point, I see. And do you consider that it likely that users of Approved Document B would have consulted this healthcare guidance to make that comparison that you're making?
No.
Right. Just while we're with this healthcare guidance, I'd like to note one point on it. If we go at page 83, we get a glossary of terms at Appendix A. And if we look in the right-hand column, we can see that there is a definition there of Class 0 surface spread of flame. Do you see that?
Yes.
And the text reads, Class 0 surface spread of flame, the classification achieved by a material or composite product which is either A, composed throughout of materials of limited combustibility, or B, and then it's got reference to the 476 Part 7 and Part 6 tests. Do you see that?
Yes.
Can you see that the definition of Class 0 in this document is different from the definition within Approved Document B?
Yes, I can see that.
Is that the first time you've noticed that?
Yes, it is, because, again, I only had those discussions about ADB very recently, so yes.
And in particular, the reference to a material or the surface of a composite product that we looked at so closely in ADB isn't in this definition, is it?
Agreed.
It's just a material or composite product, yes?
Yes.
The surface of has been removed
Yes.
in this. And you can't help us as to why the two are different?
No, I forget who. I don't believe the 2015 edition, I don't believe BRE had any involvement in the 2015 edition of HTM 0502.
Right.
I may be mistaken, but I'm fairly confident they didn't.
So you weren't previously aware that there were these two different definitions of Class 0 within these two pieces of government guidance?
No, again, the difference is a subtle one, which I've only recently been alerted to, as in that amended view of the text in ADB. Hence, I previously read the both as being the same.
Right. Now, just going back to your third witness statement and looking at page 31, paragraph 129, where you give another reason why you say readers might consider National Class 0 and limited combustibility to be at least equivalent. You say in the final lines of 129, final four lines, However, both tables A5 and A7 recognise that composites which achieve limited combustibility may fail to achieve class 0. It is therefore not the case, in my opinion, that limited combustibility is presented as being better than class 0 in all circumstances. Now, isn't that just telling readers that these are different tests, testing different things, i.e. national class 0 is testing the surface, rather than it being equivalent?
It would have been, certainly historically, the text, yes, does point to those things. The issue that arises, again, is when you sit the national classes alongside the European classes, and that there is now under the European classes a formal structure that says A2 being equivalent to limited combustibility must always be better than Class B, read Class O. Whereas this wasn't the case. But no, I agree, they're fundamentally measuring different things.
Yeah.
But the point is there is, I think there's a belief that has arisen which is linked to the hierarchical nature of the European standards, that limited combustibility must be better than Class O and equally non-combustibility must be better than limited combustibility. I agree with you, they're measuring different things, but that has become confused as a result of the dual application of both the national and the European classes and the different ways in which they're structured.
Yes, but thinking about diagram 40, that says above 18 metres it's got to be national class 0 or B, European class B. Now, that's not limited combustibility, is it? It's not A1 or A2.
Agreed.
So diagram 40 is not telling you that national class 0 is equivalent to limited combustibility, is it?
No.
No. Now, the other point you make, and you mentioned it earlier in your oral evidence, and I wanted to come back to it, is you make the point at page 32, at paragraphs 130 and 131, over the page here, you make the point and you underline it that within approved document B, national class 0 is said to be the highest product performance classification, and you've underlined those words. Why haven't you underlined the words thereafter, for lining materials? Isn't a reader being told this is the highest product performance classification for lining materials? It's not being told it's the highest product performance classification for external wall materials, is it?
No, though I would say that doesn't state internal linings, it just says linings. You can have external linings and internal linings.
I see. So are you saying that a reasonable reader of this might interpret lining materials as meaning an external wall material?
Potentially the surface product, not the entire external wall build-up, obviously, but...
Have you been aware during your career at any time of others confusing or conflating or equating the concept of national class 0 and limited combustibility?
I have. It's in, how do I put this? It's within the context of civil litigation cases that I'm involved in, yes, I have. Only in recent years, but yes.
What about thinking before that and outside the context of civil litigation? When you were at the BRE, in the roles that you performed, did you ever become aware in any of your work that there was a confusion about the difference between national class 0 and limited combustibility?
No, not at BRE, no.
You say, no, not at the BRE. I'm not just asking about the BRE. What about outside the BRE? What about in industry more generally? Did you ever become aware that there was this confusion?
Sorry, I don't follow the question. When you say industry more generally, you mean
Yeah,
when I was employed at BRE, or do you mean?
Yeah, when you were employed at the BRE,
right.
and in discussions you might have had, at conferences with other industry groups, whether that's the CWCT or other industry bodies or particular individuals who were involved in fire safety and cladding, did you ever become aware of such third parties confusing national class 0 with limited combustibility?
No, not during my time at BRE, whether within or outside of BRE.
Did you ever raise with government the fact that reasonable users of approved document B might reasonably think that class 0 was equivalent to limited combustibility? Did you ever have that conversation with anyone within government?
Well, no, because I wasn't aware at the time, but again, this has all been flushed out during the conversations around the PAS.
I see. Okay, I want to move on now to the investigation of real fires project. And that was a contract which the BRE had with central government. Now, can you just, in very simple terms, briefly describe to us what that project involved?
Yes, I can try. So the objective of the project, in its broadest sense, was to investigate fires and to identify whether or not there were aspects to the guidance within approved document B or the functional requirements at Part B of Schedule 1, which were not working as intended. I mean, that's the bottom line. So it wasn't interested in breaches and failure to comply, that sort of thing. It was interested in circumstances where people had either followed or attempted to follow the guidance, and yet there was something that had occurred that was untoward, and therefore there's an opportunity to learn something and therefore try to improve the guidance or the regulations accordingly.
Yeah. Were you ever made aware of how that project came to be? What were the drivers for it originally?
Not in detail, but I'm broadly aware that I believe it arose partly as a result of the Building Act 1984 and the approved documents, and this recognition that the UK had moved from prescriptive regulation in the preceding iterations of the building regulations through to these functional requirements and the technical guidance, and that it was as a result of that it was felt there was a need to have a watching brief, if you like, to see that things were working as intended.
Yeah, I see. Now, in your third witness statement, for the transcript, we don't need to turn it up, page 6, paragraph 27, you tell us that this investigation of real fires project was one of the first pieces of work you came to be involved in at the BRE in 2006. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you also tell us that that project has run continuously since 1988. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
Yeah, so all the way through, right through to the Grenfell Tower fire, that project continued.
Yes.
And it was run in 2006 by your senior colleague Martin Shipp until you took over and led the project from April 2015 onwards. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, if we could turn up to your second witness statement, BRE 304371 6 at page 68, and look at paragraph 244, you tell us there that you were the deputy project manager of the investigation of real fires project, and then you became the project manager of the external fire spread project within that, yes?
At the time of the external fire spread project, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I wasn't immediately deputy project manager when I started at BRE. That didn't come until some years later.
Yes, so when, I think for context, you're talking about around, in the preceding paragraphs, about October 2014, you're saying you were deputy project manager of this investigation of real fires project. Is that correct?
Yes, I was. I probably became deputy project manager in, it would either be 2012 or potentially 2009 or thereabouts.
Yeah.
Probably 2012, sorry.
2012, yeah. And was the project manager Martin Shipp?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, the reason I ask is this, because Martin Shipp tells us in his witness statement, I don't think we need to go to it, for the transcript, that's at BRE 3047594, page 24, paragraph 118. He tells us that he headed the fire investigation activities at the BRE from 1988 until 2006. And he says thereafter he was a consultant to the fire investigation team, assisting with the analysis of findings, calling upon his experience and providing historical background. So can you help us? He seems to describe himself as a consultant to the fire investigation team, but was he in that role as consultant? Was he project manager to the Real Fires project?
I believe he was. I mean, it'll be in the exhibits to my statement whether he was or not. That was my understanding, was that he was project manager up until 2015.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, the consultant point goes back to the comment I made earlier about him splitting his time between fire safety and fire investigation. So when fire investigation became a business stream and later a business group,
Yeah.
Martin divided his time accordingly, but that wasn't until 2011
Yeah.
for the business stream.
And he tells us that from 2007, Debbie Smith was the contract manager for this contract. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe so.
And we touched on this earlier, but just to be clear, what precisely was Debbie Smith's role in relation to the investigation of Real Fire's contract during that period from 2006 until you left the BRE in May 2019?
She was, I think the term was framework manager, because there were various frameworks which I've set out to the best of my knowledge in my statements, under which individual projects were led. So the fire investigation project, being what it was, which framework it happened to fall under would simply depend on when the previous contract had come to a close, and then you set up a new project under the framework. But Debbie Smith was the overall framework manager. Corinne Williams had some sort of deputy framework manager type role. Debbie, I believe, was identified on the investigation of Real Fire's project in her role as framework manager. But as I mentioned before, she didn't have a day-to-day involvement in the project.
Yeah.
But she would get involved in sort of, particularly if there were formal correspondence with government. For instance, the contract for various reasons had to be extended when government, whether it was DCLG, MHCLG, they didn't get round to issuing a new invitation to tender in time before a contract ended, so they would get an extension arranged, and that's where Debbie would definitely get involved.
Yeah. Let's turn to Cara Holland's witness statement again. That's at BRE 30/43829, page 10. And looking at paragraph 33, I just want to see if you agree with what Cara Holland's explained here. She says, on the basis of the above, Debbie Smith had overall responsibility for the contract and therefore the content of reports. The majority of reports produced were approved by Corinne Williams, acting on behalf of Debbie Smith. However, each report also went separate technical checks or peer review prior to being sent to Dr. Williams and/or Dr. Smith for approval. Who undertook these technical checks or peer reviews depended on who prepared the report. In my first couple of years at BRE, this was generally Martin Shipp and/or David Crowder. In later years, I also undertook these technical checks or peer reviews. All journal articles required approval of Debbie Smith prior to publication, and the experimental proposals and reports also required approval of Debbie Smith. Now, do you agree with what the description Cara Holland's written there?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, so do you agree that ultimate responsibility for the content of the report prepared under this contract lay at all times with Dr. Debbie Smith, or in the period from April 2015 onwards, did that responsibility lie with you when you became project manager?
Well, no. I think I replaced Martin Shipp in his role as project manager, but I believe there was still the framework manager role that sat above that.
Yeah, which was Dr. Smith.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, going back to the start of your time at the BRE in 2006, let's look at your third witness statement at page 12, paragraph 51. You say this: when I started work on the project, I understood its overarching goal was to identify instances where the guidance in approved document B or part B of the building regulations might need to be reconsidered or updated if it was considered to have failed to properly mitigate the consequences of a fire. In this regard, the project was specifically not concerned with, and then you've got some bullets, deliberate fires, accidental fires in which the cause is in no way affected by the performance of the building, or breaches of the guidance or regulations. And that's consistent with what you were just explaining in terms of what
Yes.
you were interested in. Now, did that understanding from when you started work on the project ever change or develop at any time?
I don't think so, no.
Now, again, in the witness statement of Chiara Holland, if we can go back to that, BRE 3043829 at page 17, at paragraph 51, she describes various reporting in respect of the investigation of real fires project and what that involved. And I just want to look at the headings. We don't need to look at all the details. So in subparagraph A, she said there were quarterly progress reports. She then tells us there were end-of-year reports. There were final research reports prepared at the end of a contract, which summarise the findings of a 3-year period at high level. There were one-page summary reports, which she says were prepared as a briefing to DCLG on an incident to enable approval for site investigation. There were the fires of special interest report. These were reports on Category 1 incidents. We'll come to what she describes as a Category 1 incident in a moment. And they were included as appendices to quarterly and year-end reports. Then there were follow-up investigation reports. These are reports on Category 2 incidents. And then there were journal articles. Now, just in broad terms, is that correct, that this project involved a number of different types of reports and some articles? Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, the first report which was submitted to the department after you joined the BRE was an interim report dated the 14th of December 2006, and that covered the period from the 1st of October 2006. If we could turn to that, this is at HOM 3046642. We can see in the bottom right-hand side of the page, it's described as a DCLG interim report for the third quarter of 067. Investigation of real fires underneath that, and we can see it's prepared for Anthony Bird at the DCLG, yes?
Yes.
And if we go to page 13, and looking at section 2, midway down that page, we can see a number of stated objectives for this programme. And I just want to look at a number with you, so if we could perhaps blow up that part of the page in the middle. We see a number of bullet points, and it says the objectives of this programme are, now looking at the first bullet point, it says to provide timely feedback to DCLG on the effectiveness or otherwise of the guidance in Building Regulations Approved Document B in achieving fire safety in real buildings in England and Wales, yes?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
The second bullet, to improve understanding of how unusual fires develop and grow, particularly in domestic and other residential property, yes?
Yes.
Third bullet, to monitor the impact of European standards on building materials and systems, yes?
Yes.
Then if we go down to the sixth bullet point, it's third one up from the bottom in that list, it says to identify the effect of the building regulations in failing to provide protection for firefighters, yes?
Yes.
Underneath that, point 7, to maintain close contacts with other investigators in the brigades and elsewhere to encourage the exchange of information on unusual fires that will be of benefit to DCLG, yes?
Yes.
And then the last bullet, to disseminate findings from fire investigations to the fire service, building designers and owners and others as relevant, yes?
Yes.
So the idea was that there would be a dissemination of findings from these fire investigations to a wider audience.
Yes.
Yes, is that right?
Yes.
In order that they would learn lessons from these fires.
Yes.
Is that correct? Now, the overarching goal that we looked at, that you identified in paragraph 51 of your third statement, was to identify instances where the guidance in approved document B or part B of the building regulations might need to be reconsidered or updated if it was considered it had failed. Just to be absolutely clear, was that your understanding that that remained a principal objective of the investigation of real fires project from 2006 until 2012, yes?
Yes.
And was it your understanding that during that period, such instances were to be identified in the project reports which were submitted to the department?
Yes.
And was that done during that period as far as you're aware?
As far as I'm aware, yes.
And if we turn back to your third witness statement now, at page 12, paragraph 52, you explain that one of the objectives was to identify and indicate, this is picking up at the end of the second line, to identify and indicate the need for research or for changes to Part B, ADB, arising out of specific problems highlighted in fire investigations, yes?
Yes.
And in paragraph 53, you say this, you say, however, that objective in relation to Part B, ADB, ceased in the proposal issued in October 2012, when the objectives in the invitation to tender and therefore the proposal in response were amended to focus on monitoring and providing feedback. And you go on to say, from this point on, there was an express requirement for BRE not to make any policy recommendations. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, were you still the deputy project manager for this contract in October 2012?
I think that's when I became deputy project manager.
I see. And the project manager would have been Martin Shipp at that time? Yes?
I believe so, yes.
Now, let's go to that October 2012 proposal that you're quoting from there, that you say changed things. If we could turn to that in your... if we could turn to that directly, it appears at BRE 50951. So this is the October 2012 proposal. We can see it's prepared by Martin Shipp and approved by Debbie Smith on the 1st of October 2012, yes?
Yes.
And page 4, if we go down to page 4, we can see from the second paragraph down, under that introduction, this research proposal is submitted on the understanding that the new contract will have a duration of approximately 29 months from the 1st of November 2012 to the 31st of March 2015, with some breakpoints in it as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
So just under 2.5 years, yeah?
Yes.
And that this proposal was accepted and the contract was let to the BRE, yes?
Yes.
Now, staying on page 4 and looking at the list of overriding objectives, we can see, if we look, for example, at the third bullet point down, it's stated there to be to provide DCLG with unbiased, robust and independent evidence information to enable the DCLG to take a proactive approach in ensuring that policies and guidance remain proportionate to the risk and continue to be fit for purpose, but also to support the continued review of general policies in order to identify and or remove, simplify existing regulations that have the potential to unnecessarily impede growth. And then if we look at bullet point 5, we can see it's to monitor the effectiveness of Part B of the building regulations and the guidance in ADB in achieving fire safety in real buildings in England and in providing protection for firefighters. Similarly, monitor the impact of British, European and international standards on building products and systems which have a consequence on real incidents in England. Do you see that?
Yes.
And if we look at the penultimate bullet point on that page 4, we can see it's the 10th bullet point. It's also to identify and indicate areas for research or for potential changes to Part B, ADB, arising from specific problems highlighted in fire investigations. Do you have all that?
I see that, yes.
Now, keeping those objectives in mind, can we go down to page 51? There is a section in the middle of the page where it says all reports will, and then a number of solid bullet points. Do you have that?
Yes.
And the third bullet point down, it says all reports will, and then it goes on, not contain any policy recommendations. All reports produced by BRE for this project will not contain any proposed text for a revision to an approved document or supporting guidance. With the agreement of or at the request of DCLG, such material will only be provided in a separate policy implications report as and when necessary and following the format of a Type 3 report, as this will typically need to be published separately. Now, you've explained in your witness statement that that was a contractual requirement, yes, that these reports were to contain no policy recommendations. Is that right?
That was my understanding, yes.
And was this change to this contract something that you were actually aware of at the time in October 2012?
I believe I was. I believe there was a project kick-off meeting very early on where that was discussed and the point was made that effectively we would only be providing policy recommendations on request. We weren't to just volunteer our own policy recommendations, that the department wanted strict control effectively of whether it needed to respond to any policy recommendations.
I see. And who was at that meeting, that kick-off meeting, and who explained that to you?
I believe it would have been attended by, so from BRE, Martin Ship, Kira Holland, probably, and myself. She would have only been very recently in the job at that point. And from DCLG, Brian Martin, certainly. Steve Kelly, I think, may have been involved at the start of this project, but his tenure at DCLG wasn't very long. But Steve was, I believe, he took the sort of the lion's share of the responsibility for the content of this of the invitation to tender. Sorry.
I see. Now, was any consideration given at that time, or was there any discussion at that time about the potential impact of this change on the ability or otherwise of the BRE to meet the objectives of the contract, as we saw earlier in the document? Was that discussed?
I believe Martin Ship might have expressed some misgivings, but I couldn't specifically say what was said. I'm afraid I can't recall.
Okay. Can you recall whether there was any discussion about the value of the project in terms of informing policy on fire safety matters if it wasn't to contain any policy recommendations?
No, I don't think there was a discussion around it fundamentally devaluing the project.
And can you recall anything that Brian Martin said about it and this change?
My recollection is he had his instructions, as it were, from the department. He was there, doing a job. I'm not convinced that he necessarily agreed with it, but it wasn't his decision at the end of the day. So,
can I just explore, how did you understand the scope of what's precluded? How far does it go? Because it says not contain any policy recommendations. Then it says all reports produced by BRE for this project will not contain any proposed text for a revision to an approved document or supporting guidance. What exactly was precluded so far as you understood it?
Proposed text was definitely excluded. I don't recall this specific incident, but I believe there was a suggestion made in a report prior to this contract which caused some unease or unhappiness at the department, and the result was this amendment to the contract. So, but if I understand what you're saying, I agree that it's vague and it doesn't really set out exactly what is precluded and what is not precluded under the contract.
Yes, well, I was just focusing in particular on will not contain any proposed text for a revision to an approved document. So on one reading of that, you can't actually write out what should change in an approved document or what the new wording of it should be. But does that mean that you can't explain that there needs to be a change to approved document B, or that a change is at least requiring
that was our understanding. We had the scope of the project had been changed to one of us. We were evidence gatherers, effectively. So it was fine for us to identify trends and say how things looked in terms of the fires that were being investigated, but we couldn't go any further than that, and it would be for the department to decide. what it did in response to the evidence that was gathered.
That was a pretty fundamental change, wasn't it?
Yes, I suppose it was.
Was there a specific reason provided to you for this change?
Not formally, no.
You mentioned a little bit earlier that there'd been an incident where the BRE had said something in a report that the department hadn't liked. Can you tell us what that was about?
I'm afraid I can't remember. When you mention it, it sticks out in my mind that there was something they were unhappy with. And I suspect it would sit with the timing of this. It came after the general move towards deregulation. So more regulation was not welcome.
How did you come, you just said earlier in your evidence that you came to have the impression that Brian Martin didn't necessarily agree with this change. How did you come to have that impression? Did he say something to that effect to you?
Again, I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to recall any specific words that he said, but it was my general impression of his demeanour, the tone of the way things were said. He knew what his role was as a civil servant, a fairly junior civil servant, I think, in the grand scheme of things. And not necessarily at this meeting, but I've had, discussions with him about how he understands the concerns and he passes them up the line, but that doesn't necessarily get him anywhere, or didn't get him anywhere.
Right. When do you recall having those conversations with him?
It's difficult to say. Again, it would be part of this whole deregulation. It would be post 2010, effectively.
Yeah. Did you discuss this change within the BRE? For example, was it discussed between you, Martin Shipp, and Debbie Smith?
No, I almost certainly would have discussed it with Martin Shipp. I don't think it would have been discussed with Debbie Smith. I think, the ITT was what it was, and we were expected to service the needs set out in the ITT.
Let's just go back to page 4, because we looked at a number of bullet points on that page, and just want to pick up on a couple of them. The penultimate bullet point that I read to you was to identify, it's right at the bottom of that page now, to identify and indicate areas for research or for potential changes to Part B ADB arising from specific problems highlighted in fire investigations. Did anybody point out that the objective not to make any policy recommendations was potentially directly in conflict with that stated objective of the project?
I can't remember. It doesn't stick out in my mind that anyone did, but it's not impossible that someone did.
Did anyone ask themselves within the BRE, or did you ask yourself, how am I going to achieve that objective to identify and indicate areas for potential changes to Part B ADB whilst not making policy recommendations and not providing any supposed text of ADB?
I suppose, I'm probably surmising at this point with hindsight.
I don't want you to surmise.
No, that's what I'm trying to avoid.
Yeah. I want to know if anybody actually applied their minds to how these overarching objectives fitted with what we saw later in this document at page 51.
Not to my recollection. No, not to my recollection.
Did you understand that you still had an obligation to be identifying and indicating areas for research or potential changes to Part B and ADB after this point?
We did, and I mean, it was, that objective was probably not correctly, but it was always, whether or not the contract called for it, it's always something that you think about when you attend a fire. It was one of the fundamental questions I would ask myself: is the guidance working? Thinking practically, I mean, the only way we could have met that objective is probably the way that we did, which is by no means ideal, but it was to have conversations. We'd occasionally speak to Brian and others when we attend an incident, what we've seen, what we think is going on, but there's never a written record.
Yes,
Which
we'll
is
come
the-
back to this point, but in principle, you can raise concerns informally, can't you, still?
Yes.
What about the objective at bullet 5 on this page, to monitor the effectiveness of Part B of the building regulations and the guidance in ADB? Again, did anyone think about how am I going to monitor the effectiveness of the regulations and guidance without being able to point out any parts found to be ineffective?
Well, the way we did that in practice is that so at the end of each, particularly the fire special interest reports, there was a summary set of what we called implications. They weren't recommendations as such because we weren't allowed, but we did try and tease out what the type of issues were that had occurred in a fire and map them onto the relevant parts, B1 to B5, of the approved document and Part B in that way.
I see. It sounds like a rather uncomfortable process you had to go through
It's not
to
ideal.
somehow... Sorry?
It's not ideal.
No. So you were somehow having to signal, without making any recommendations, that there might be areas that the department ought to think carefully about, yes?
Yes.
But you couldn't say so directly?
No.
And you felt, in practice, hobbled in that way, did you?
Yes, though not specifically in relation to this contract. It goes back to the wider piece about the state of government research in relation to fire safety. It was part of, culture's the wrong word, but the atmosphere, if you like, around where fire safety under building regulations was going at that time.
Right. And would it be right that any policy implications report would only be provided or written at all at the request of the department?
That was my understanding, yes.
And those reports were subject to review, amendment and ultimate approval by the department, yes?
Yes.
Back to page 51 and that text that we were looking at, third bullet down in the middle of the page, not to contain policy recommendations. It states that any policy implication reports need to be provided or published separately. Can you help us? Were policy implication reports ever released into the public domain, as far as you were aware?
I don't think so, but I may be wrong, I don't think a policy implications report was ever requested. So there would not be one to release into the public domain.
That was my next question.
Okay.
As far as you're aware, did the BRE ever write or submit to the department any policy implications report?
Not to the best of my knowledge, no.
So it follows there was no such policy implications report on external fire spread at any stage?
Correct.
Did you ever ask the department if a policy implications report could be prepared on any particular aspect of the regulations or guidance?
I've got a feeling we did, and the answer was no.
Do you remember what that topic was on?
That's
What
I'm trying
subject?
to remember. It might have been in relation to cable fixings.
So can you be sure that it wasn't in relation to anything to do with external fire spread?
Pretty sure, yes.
Now, I want to move on to some questions now about how the investigation of real fires project worked in practice. And let's look at your third witness statement again at page 43, paragraph 173. You give us some details in this statement. You say, each year, the investigation of real fires project would prepare a few hundred summaries, although numbers could vary significantly depending on the quality of information available in the media and the types of fires occurring. In July 2010 to July 2011, the year of Sudbury House, the number was 204, whereas in July 2011 to July 2012, the year of Taplow House, the number was 511. And then you note the 2011 to 2012 period was extended to October, hence the larger figure in the table below. The budget for the project allowed for 28 days per year to be spent on the preparation of summaries, which included monitoring news reports to find fires and sifting out those which were deemed not worth summarising. And you go on to tell us that there were 92,248 fires in 2010, 2011, around nearly 87,000 fires in 2011, 2012, of which over half were in buildings and therefore potentially relevant. In practice, around 3/4 of time was spent on monitoring and 1/4 on writing summaries, equating to around 15 minutes per fire. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, just focusing on that very last sentence there, you say in practice around 3/4 of time was spent on monitoring. When you've referred to monitoring, are you referring to monitoring news and media reports?
Yes.
And how was that done in practice? Was that online?
It was online. When I first started at BRE, the BBC was relied upon quite heavily, as was a website at the time called FireNet. There was a time, probably linked to the financial crash in fairness, when the BBC's reporting quality declined, and it took us a little while to figure out alternatives, for want of a better word. But by the time I left BRE, we had a fairly elaborate set of RSS feeds linked to Fire and Rescue Service incident pages and various other means of trying to get alerts so that we, or whoever was doing the summaries, wouldn't have to physically trawl through all of these, dozens and dozens of websites to try and find summaries. So we did work quite hard to try and compensate for the, how sources of information changed and declined, and trying to be as efficient as we can given the restricted resource for the project.
Yeah. At paragraph 174, below the one we just read, you tell us, you say, at the time of these fires stroke reports, the routine in the team was for someone to be the nominated person preparing summaries each week. That person would typically spend approximately an hour per day or a day per half day per week reviewing media reports and preparing summaries on the relevant fires, yes?
Yes.
And those summaries, there you've referred to writing summaries again, they were also prepared from reading media reports, is that right?
Yes, sorry, to clarify, so monitoring and the writing of summaries goes hand in hand.
Exactly. And is it fair to say that monitoring media and preparing summaries from media reports made up the main body of activity under this contract, is that right?
It was certainly the most regular activity on the contract. Whether it's the majority of the budget that's available, I should know, it's on the next page of the table, but it might be, yes. Yeah.
Now, if we look at the second witness statement provided to the inquiry by Martin Shipp, this is at BRE 30475594, page 25. And at paragraph 123, starting in the 4 lines down in 123, he says, and it's the last 3 lines of that paragraph, from the continuous monitoring of fires in the news, the BRE team identifies and selects fires to report on. These short reports are based on available information from the media and or readily available local fire and rescue service reports of the fire. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So is it possible that sometimes there would be readily available local fire and rescue service reports of the fire?
Yes, obviously it's not my statement, but I think Martin Shipp is referring to the incidents pages, which would sometimes be very helpful. So each fire and rescue service on their website had, I'd forget whether they still have or not, but an incident page that simply gives a continual feed of not every incident they attend, but the ones they deem to be of significance, or where they might have issued guidance to the local neighbourhood as a result, closing of windows, that sort of thing. So I think that's what he's referring to. Obviously, it's ultimately his statement.
So those are publicly available reports from those fire and rescue services, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. And then at paragraph 124 below that, he says this: when researching fires, facts may emerge that justify a more detailed in-depth report being written. A list of high and low priority considerations is agreed with the government at the outset of the contract. And then he gives an example. Using this list of high and low priority considerations, the facts of the fire may make it evident that a more detailed examination and a more thorough report is needed, but as a desk-based study, usually by seeking further information from the fire officers involved with the incident. So in summary, he's saying that you had a list of high and low priority considerations as agreed with the government, yes?
Yes.
And using that list of priorities, the facts of a fire might make it evident that you needed to go beyond just doing a summary and actually do what he describes as a desk-based study. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And that would be seeking further information from the fire officers who'd been involved in the incident. Yeah.
Yes.
And he also goes on to say in paragraph 125, I think I can paraphrase, that the facts of a particular fire incident may make it apparent that a site visit was needed. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And is he right, as he explains in paragraph 125, that on-site investigations could only take place with the specific agreement of the department? So with, for example, MHCLG.
Yes.
Who was it within the BRE that would decide whether to seek agreement from the department to attend the scene of a fire incident?
I mean, ultimately, that would be the decision for the project manager, but it wouldn't be fair to Martin Shipp to say that he was always taking that on up until the end of his role as project manager. I think I started exercising a certain amount of discretion around that before 2015, as indeed did Kira. You get a sense of when a fire is worth escalating or not, and it's not always possible to consult with the project manager before you escalate to government.
Yeah. And who was it who decided which fires might merit going to the next stage, which is the more thorough desk-based assessment or study?
The same as
Same.
my previous answer,
Yeah.
yes.
And you've set out an example of high and low priority considerations that Mr. Shipp's referred to in your own witness statement, and we'll go to that in a moment. Do you agree with Mr. Shipp that that list, the high and low priorities, was agreed with government at the outset of the contract?
Yes, I think it was even stipulated within their ITTs, maybe not for all the contracts, but I'm fairly confident it appeared in at least one or two of the ITTs.
How were those high and low priorities actually identified as far as you understood it?
So taking the 2012 contract as an example, and the kick-off meeting that I referred to, we would have a discussion sometimes about what we thought of the high and low priority list, whether we were content with it as was, whether it needed amending, whether there were any particular themes that it felt needed to be added to either the high or the low priority list, and we'd go from there. I suspect, at the start of each contract, there was a Dear Chief Officer letter that was issued notifying all of the fire and rescue services of the contract having been renewed, and that requesting that they cooperate with the contract or with BRE to enable the contract to be fulfilled. I think all the Dear Chief Officer letters contained the high and low priority list, so that we wanted them to understand what we were looking for, in the hope that that would facilitate or prompt them to decide when to contact us about particular fires. So I would, given there was a drafting process for that Dear Chief Officer letter, I think we did revisit the list each time we wrote that letter.
Yeah. And who had the final say on the list of high and low priorities? Was that the BRE or the department?
I think that would have been the department ultimately. If they said we weren't to look at something, then we're not to look at something.
Do you ever recall there being any disagreement about the high and low priority areas?
I'm sure we did have a disagreement, and I don't think it was, it wasn't a hugely contentious disagreement, but I'm sure we did have debates and sometimes disagreements relating to sort of issues that were peripheral to buildings. So, for instance, there was a period of time when we were interested in fires in vehicles, and then that was sort of moved to one side. Sorry, I'm struggling to think of a specific example.
Okay,
I'm sure there were debates. It wasn't always a consensus from the outset.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's an appropriate moment for our lunch.
Right. Yes, thank you very much. Well, I think it's time we stop for some lunch, Dr. Crowder. We'll finish there. We'll resume, please, at 2:00. And again, as I said earlier, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while they're out of the room. All right? Thank you very much. Would you go to the usher, please? Thank you very much. 2:00, please.